Jesse Barron is a journalist who's written for New York Mag, Esquire, and recently GQ. Earlier this year, Jesse flew out to Puerto Rico to attend a party called Cocktails and Compliance these super rich people were having. His latest piece in GQ was about what was driving these super rich people to the island and what he witnessed and encountered firsthand. I recently reached out to Jesse to talk to him about his GQ piece on Puerto Rico. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. You recently wrote an article in GQ about how Puerto Rico has become a tax haven for the super rich. In your article, you write about what you witnessed firsthand from some of the wealthiest Americans on the mainland here. How were you able to get invited, let alone get people to let you quote them on the record about their conversations?
First of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for interviewing me. So I got in touch with a guy many months ago named Rob Rill, who's the sort of head of a group called the Act 2023 Society, which is the sort of central social organization of what I'm calling tax hackers and what they would call degree recipients, people who are coming there to get the tax benefit. And I said to Rill that I was interested in writing an article about the group that he was a part of, these people who've moved down for tax reasons, and could I come down and visit? And many months went by, and finally in March, Rill got back in touch with me and said that he was about to throw a party called Cocktails and Compliance, which was the annual social gathering for this group. And I said I would love to go. I want to be a part of Cocktails and Compliance. I pitched the story to GQ and sort of bought a plane ticket the next week. And then once I was at that party, it was very easy to meet everyone because people were drinking, having a good time, and I was able to get a ton of different sources from that party. But the key was really, that this one person generously allowed me to come down and go to a single cocktail party. And that opened up the whole little world to me.
Okay, so how long were you on the island for?
About 5 days.
Have you been to Puerto Rico before?
I have not.
Was there any particular reason why they called it Cocktails and Compliance? Or is it just a name they made up?
It's a name they made up, but it refers to the signature mixture of alcohol and tax advice. Compliance is in compliance with the IRS tax code. So it's their sort of slightly cute or self-aware description of what they're doing. That we're doing a little bit of drinking, a little bit of partying, but we're really here to understand how to get the most out of this tax benefit.
In your article, you talk about two different tax acts, Act 20 and Act 22. Could you tell me what those were?
Absolutely. So Act 20 and 22 are a pair of tax laws that were passed by the Puerto Rican government in 2012. If you were not a resident of Puerto Rico when the act passed and you became a resident after, you are eligible to pay a 0% rate on your income from dividends, interest, and capital gain, Act 22. So if you're an investor or a hedge fund manager or the owner of a private equity firm, that's great for you. The other act that you mentioned, Act 20, also passed the same year, except that's a tax break for corporations. So if you're a corporation on Puerto Rico and you export services to the U.S., you pay a 4% tax rate. The big difference between them, there's two. One is that Act 22 is for individuals and Act 20 is for corporations. And the other is that Act 22 is really unavailable for native-born Puerto Ricans, whereas Act 20 is available to anyone.
So why are native-born Puerto Ricans excluded from this tax on Act 20 too?
That is a great question. So the legal reason is that if you were a resident at the time the act passed, you're not eligible. You can't have been a resident in the 6 years before the act passed. So realistically, that means anyone who's living in Puerto Rico, who's born in Puerto Rico and was already a resident, isn't eligible. That's the legal reason. But that's not the sort of conceptual reason why they made the law that way. The purpose of these laws from the government standpoint is to juice the economy. They want capital. They want investment. They want millionaires. They want real estate deals. They want people going to restaurants, supporting clubs, building houses, hiring housekeepers, hiring accountants, hiring lawyers, and so on. So the way to get that money down to Puerto Rico is to offer the kinds of incentives that rich people like. And one incentive that rich people really like is tax breaks. So the idea is there's all of this money out there sitting around in the U.S., and we want to draw it down here.
According to your article, they've attracted all these millionaires and billionaires. You call them basically the middle-class rich, which was kind of interesting there. You're saying that the idea was to get them here to come juice the economy. But it sounds like the economy is kind of wrecked over there. So is that not working exactly the way they planned?
That's a great question. So certainly the economy has been in trouble for a long time, and that predates this economic policy. So one of the common sort of misconceptions about this, I think, is that the case against it amounts to tax them, and it would fix the economy. And that's not true. This is a group of people who, if taxed, would not suddenly magic balance the budget of the Puerto Rican government. However, the economic case for these exemptions rests on the idea that they're contributing something. So they've hired 12,000 people. That's a mix of housekeepers, accountants, and lawyers, and so on. And they've contributed a bunch of money into the real estate market and into restaurants, hotels, and clubs. So there's a lot of people who say that's really good, and we wouldn't have that money here otherwise, and that's enough. Then there's other people who say that's not worth it. that small amount of economic development is not worth the increased inequality that these policies cause.
You talked about in your article that you're walking around San Juan and you said the recovery over there was uneven. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hurricane affected different areas of the island differently, and it affected rich areas differently than poor areas. So the area near Old San Juan that includes a neighborhood called Condado and includes Santurce and Old San Juan has recovered a little more quickly. That's where the hotels are and the nightclubs and so on. So there was a lot of money there from private developers and private hotel owners to hasten the recovery in those areas. Outside of those areas, you have streetlights that don't work. You have, houses that are totally boarded up, hotels that have never reopened. You have, FEMA staging relief supplies along the waterfront next to apartment buildings that are, sort of stalled in their construction. So it's really two different worlds: the world of money and of people without money.
It sounds like, from what you're saying here, is that the rich people that moved over there, they basically got their areas working right off the bat from after Maria passed by, while the rest of the Puerto Rican population is still struggling to get by now with hurricane season here.
Yes, that's basically right. So a lot of these, what I call tax hackers in the piece, live in a neighborhood called Dorado Beach, which is a large neighborhood outside San Juan that includes a resort partly managed by the Ritz-Carlton Corporation. So these are, multi-million-dollar houses sort of set on a golf course. There's helipads that take you to the private airport. There's, sunset yoga on the beach. You drive your golf cart around. And so that enclave where a lot of these guys live was hit by the hurricane, to the extent that, the spa had to close and the hotel had to close. But there were private armed security forces that protected it. And a lot of the residents during the hurricane took a private flight and left for New York. So those people were not directly affected the same way that someone who couldn't get out and didn't have the money for power generators or, let alone for private security might have experienced the hurricane.
These super rich people, do they interact with the general population, or do they pretty much just kind of stave themselves off and just mingle among themselves?
That's a good question. There is definitely interaction between the super rich who've come down there for the tax benefit and the sort of top of the local economy. So these are people who absolutely hire Puerto Rican-born CAs, Puerto Rican-born lawyers. They interact with Puerto Rican restaurateurs, club owners. There's a lot of people who have moved back to the island, native-born Puerto Ricans who've opened businesses that cater to these guys. So, for example, I spoke to a woman named Maria Ortiz who used to work in finance and moved back to San Juan to start a business that provides housekeeping services to these people. So for her, it's a great benefit, these tax acts. She's like, this is allowing me to come home and do this business. So there's definitely that tier of people that interact with the super rich, with the tax hackers. However, there's also a whole other part of the economy that has nothing to do with them. So one anecdote that I share in the piece is that pool party that they all attend every weekend at the Serafina Hotel in Condado is across the street from a sort of row of shops, of liquor stores and so on. And the guy who happened to be working in the liquor store when this party was taking place, I kind of juxtapose with the sort of glitz and glamour of the party, and described his life and his, wages and his tax situation. And he said, I never see these people. They never come in here. But of course, they're all partying, right across the street. So that kind of thing is revealing to me that they are maybe less integrated into the sort of fabric of the city in that way, even if they can say with a straight face, my lawyer is Puerto Rican.
So it sounds like from reading your piece that there is a certain requirement for these people to live, to qualify for this tax break about living on the island for 183 days, but there's a loophole to that.
That's right. So there's two real big requirements that you have to satisfy. One of them is that your primary tax home, which is just IRS fancy speak for your main house, has to be in Puerto Rico. And you have to spend 183 days out of the year on the island, so just, a day over half a year. Now, a lot of people spend hundreds of days, and far exceed the 183, 200 days, or, in some cases even 300 days. But you don't necessarily have to do that. One of the most surprising stipulations of this tax act is that 1 minute on the island counts as a full day, which means that you can, touch down the jet in the airport, get a receipt from the airport Starbucks to prove that you were there, and then continue on to Miami for dinner or to the Virgin Islands. So there's plenty of ways to play fast and loose with these requirements. Another important thing to remember about the second requirement, which is the tax home requirement, is that you don't have to sell your property in the U.S. You just can't make it your primary tax home. So what you'll find is that a lot of these people who used to live in Connecticut and maybe spend, the summer in the Virgin Islands basically reverse their lives. And that house that used to be their primary house becomes their summer house in Connecticut.
Now, you're talking about they have to make their mainland home in Puerto Rico, but from reading one of your articles, it said that a guy got chased down by the IRS because his wife was still living in the States.
So that's a big piece. Yes, that's right. So the reason that gets people into trouble is that the IRS wants to see that you're what they call a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico. And that's a kind of catch-all term. And it means that your life is based in Puerto Rico. Your family's in Puerto Rico. Your primary tax home is in Puerto Rico. Your business is in Puerto Rico. So people are often tempted when they hear about this law to say, well, look, my kid's about to be in college, so he'll stay in high school, and my wife will stay behind in Dallas, and they'll never know. The big kind of cloud that's hanging over this whole experiment is that the IRS has audited very, very few of these people so far. And part of that is because the IRS is really depleted under Trump, but the expectation is that at some point the IRS will increase the percentage of these people that are being audited, and if they find stuff like people whose wives are living in New York City and they're pretending to live in Puerto Rico, that a wave of audits would come over these people.
With this 1 minute loophole, basically, so they could basically, as you're saying, they could just fly, say a resident in Florida decides to move over to Puerto Rico, but they would only have to, get on a boat, step on land, and then go right back to Florida, and it would count as a day spent in Puerto Rico, if I'm understanding that?
Yeah, that's right, as long as their actual house was in Puerto Rico, as long as they really did live, as long as they had a real residence in Puerto Rico. Yes, that would work. But, look, imagine it from the perspective of someone who's actually doing that, of what a giant pain in the ass that would actually be. To be like flying back and forth for 1 minute in order to try to save on capital gains tax. I think in general, people who do this decide to move there and they live there. And I don't think the main problem with these laws is that they're easy to manipulate. I think there's another problem with them that's significant, but the main one is not the 1 minute rule or that it's easy to cheat. Some people, I'm sure, cheat, but it's really hard. Imagine you're getting on a boat, every day to get a minute at the airport in Puerto Rico. That's no way to live.
With businesses going over there for this tax break, are they required to hire Puerto Rican citizens?
Great question. They used to be, but they're not anymore. Originally, Act 22 and Act 20 had all of these requirements that were baked into the laws. One of the requirements was that you had to hire 5 Puerto Rican employees, and another requirement was that you had to buy property. And gradually, those requirements sort of fell away. So now you're not required to do either of those. The way that the government defended that when I asked them about it is that those requirements are trivial compared to all of the economic activity that these people will generate if they come down. In other words, once you get millionaire investors and hedge fund guys and real estate developers and so on in the city, they will cause an explosion of economic activity. And they'll hire tons of people, and they'll patronize local businesses, and they'll buy property, and so on. So they're saying it doesn't matter. These requirements are trivial compared to the impact they can have. However, the problem is you open the door to people who do not intend to hire employees, who do not intend to start businesses, and who view it more like a vacation. And there's nothing in the law that prevents someone from, spending all day driving a golf cart around the Ritz and claiming the tax break.
The governor's defending these policies. He thinks they're bringing economic boom, and you're basically trying to tell me that it's really not. It's pretty much in a really centralized area and not spread out over the island.
Absolutely. There's no way that any government official could, with a straight face, make the case that this is lifting the economic fortunes of the island. I think what they would say is that it's a start in the right direction. That ultimately what we want is not 1,500 people who are there for tax reasons, but 15,000 or 20,000. And that if we had a huge number of these rich people down in San Juan, there would be a massive explosion of economic activity, and suddenly the economy would start to turn around. But here's the problem with these policies, I think. It's not that the government is being cheated out of a little bit of tax revenue. Because, again, these people are not making enough money that it would suddenly overnight balance the budget if you tax them. The issue is that it's a kind of social experiment. It's a trickle-down economic social experiment. And the experiment goes like this. It says Puerto Rico, if it were a state, would be the poorest in the Union by far if it became the 51st state. And these people that you're bringing down to this island are among the richest in the existing 50. So the disparity is really acute. There's a collision between the sort of super wealthy on the mainland and this very poor territory that is not a state and does not have a tremendous amount of political power. So you're introducing this group that has a huge amount of economic power and as a result can wield political power and power in the real estate market and so on. And I think that's really what people need to look at more than the fact that the government is losing out potentially on a little bit of capital gains tax.
So I imagine, you've said that you've interacted with some of the citizens. What are their feelings about becoming a 51st state?
Well, the statehood question really exceeds, the scope of the article, but here's what I learned. The group of people who's come down here, who's come down to Puerto Rico for the tax exemption, so the rich people that I interview who are living on the Ritz and so on, they are adamantly opposed to statehood. And the reason they're opposed to statehood is that the entire reason that Puerto Rico can tinker with its tax code is that it's a territory. So as far as the U.S. government is concerned, Puerto Rico is almost like a foreign country tax-wise. That's why they're able to give people a huge capital gains break and so on, because they're not governed in that way by the IRS. There's no federal income tax in Puerto Rico. So those people don't want there to be statehood. At the same time, the governor who passed the policy, Luis Fortuño, and his successor, Ricardo Rosselló, are part of a sort of pro-statehood party. Yet, they've passed this policy that creates a very powerful rich interest group whose interests are diametrically opposed to statehood. So that's a very interesting and an unusual thing to have done that I think really deserves more scrutiny. As far as what Puerto Ricans want, I think it really varies. There's been several referenda for statehood, and in general, the results are very, very high pro-statehood votes on extremely low turnout. In other words, you'll have like a 98% vote for statehood on a 20 or 23% turnout. So that's somewhat inconclusive. The people on the left, I interview a politician who ran against the current governor, a guy named Rafael Bernabe, who's much farther to the left in the ruling party. I think his position is that Puerto Rico should probably be independent. And it seems that there's a lot more energy in that direction on the left right now, viewing Puerto Rico not as a potential candidate for statehood, but as a colony that ought to be independent.
Do they still want to be connected to the United States or just as recognized as their own country now?
Well, independence would mean recognition as its own country. The argument for independence is that Puerto Rico is effectively a conquered territory, that it was handed to the U.S. in 1898 as a concession after the Spanish-American War, that it has a totally different culture, different language, that it doesn't really belong to the continental U.S., and it's only ours because of some, geopolitical shenanigans that occurred more than 100 years ago. So they would say, yeah, so certainly those on the left who support independence would say, yes, it should be its own country.
You've mentioned in your article a little bit briefly that a lot of manufacturing jobs used to come here and then pharmaceutical companies came here. What happened with those jobs?
Oh, yeah, so that's a whole crazy part of this story. So when the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico as a concession after the Spanish-American War, we turned it into a workshop for the low-wage production of sugar. And there were vast sugar plantations, some tobacco as well, and a lot of sugar was produced in Puerto Rico and shipped to the U.S. mainland. When the Depression hit, the price of sugar cratered, and Congress engineered a quota system that effectively kneecapped the Puerto Rican sugar industry so that the sugar-producing states in the U.S. could have a chance to survive the Depression. The next phase of manufacturing after sugar collapse was the post-war manufacturing boom that was engineered by a series of tax breaks. So then you had electronics manufacturers, glass factories, cement factories, Starkist, the tuna company, had big factories in Puerto Rico, and these people were getting exemptions from Congress in order to manufacture. And so that ignited a huge boom in the middle of the century from up until, really the 80s, where you had all of these companies that were manufacturing goods in Puerto Rico. Tax base was up. An entire generation of Puerto Ricans went to public school for the first time. And so that policy was, relatively speaking, a success. As part of that economic strategy of let's give some tax breaks to manufacturing companies so they go down to Puerto Rico, pharmaceutical companies started to come down in the 70s and 80s. And that was a huge part of Puerto Rican industry and employment, and a kind of little-known avenue of the history history of the U.S. and this island. So in the 70s and 80s, 17 of the 21 most prescribed pharmaceuticals in the U.S. were manufactured in Puerto Rico. Pfizer got $150,000 per employee per year in tax breaks to manufacture in Puerto Rico. Most of the world's Viagra was until recently manufactured in Barceloneta, which is an hour west of San Juan, because of tax breaks. But the problem with tax breaks is they expire. And when this round of manufacturing tax breaks expired that had supported the pharmaceutical industry, those provisions were sunset in 2006, the pharmaceutical companies said, well, we don't owe you guys anything. We're not a Puerto Rican company. Our kids don't go to school here, So let's move to another country that has better tax rates. And today, a lot of Viagra is manufactured in Ireland. So the story of manufacturing in Puerto Rico illustrates both the risk and the rewards of these policies. The short term, they can give you a boom, and suddenly 20,000 people are employed by a pharmaceutical company, and everyone is making Viagra, and there's tax revenue. And then the next day, the tax breaks expire, and you realize that the company that provided those jobs doesn't really care about you specifically. So in some ways, this is a cautionary tale for any American city that is about to bend over backwards to give Amazon a bunch of tax breaks to build a headquarters. These policies tend to work in the short term, but those people are not loyal to you, and if someone else offers better breaks, they will leave.
So you talked about Ricardo Rosillo that would appear every now and then on TV talking about austerity. How is austerity going over there?
Well, it depends who you ask. If you're an average Puerto Rican citizen who has watched, their power grid go unrepaired forever and then be destroyed by a hurricane and plunge the island into a prolonged blackout, then these policies make no sense. You say what we need is more development, more government spending, more infrastructure. If you are on the other side of that table, which is to say if you're someone who holds those bonds, right? Like if you're a New York hedge fund that bought Puerto Rican debt in 2014 and you want to be paid, then austerity is great for you because you want the schools to be, to stay closed. You want power grid to be unrepaired because you want all of that money to go to pay your bond debt. And the reason that Rosillo is in such a tight spot is that he is Rosillo is the son of a former governor who went to MIT and went back to become the governor of Puerto Rico. So he's absolutely to the manner born, and he's fluent in the language of global finance, and he's friends with a lot of these ministers that he has who themselves are friendly with finance, There's a suspicion, it's not even a suspicion, it's just a fact, that the government of Puerto Rico tends to favor these powerful financial interests at the expense of their constituents. And the Puerto Rican austerity policies, which is, basically saying let's cut down on basic services in order not to default on this debt, can seem in that light really cruel to people who had nothing to do with this calamity. It wasn't like average Puerto Ricans were out in New York issuing expensive bond debt that they couldn't pay. That was the government.
It sounds like you spent most of the time over in San Juan, is that correct?
Yes.
So, and it sounds like you talked to Ricardo. Did you ever run into Carmen, Yulin, Cruz?
Sorry, to be clear, I did not talk to Rosillo. I talked to his Minister of Economic Development, who's responsible for implementing these policies. So I did talk to his government, but I didn't talk to him.
Okay.
No, I wish I had met Carmen Yulin Cruz, but I did not, sadly. I would have loved to.
Is she as popular over there as she is over here on the mainland? Is Carmen Yulin Cruz as popular in San Juan as she is over here on the mainland?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I can say that the people who I spoke to were more preoccupied with financial policies that are set on the level of the governor. So they were less day-to-day aware of Yulin Cruz because their lives seemed more determined by policies that were set higher up. But from what I can tell, she was, she's a beloved figure, and certainly, her ability to draw attention to the situation around Maria when Trump was throwing paper towels into the air in an airplane hangar or whatever won her a lot of support, as it should.
I assume that Trump's really not popular over there still.
Trump is unpopular in Puerto Rico, yes. It's a safe assumption, yes. And, the unpopularity of Trump in Puerto Rico, of course, it's deeply offensive that he's lying about the death count and understating how many people died and calling the recovery a great success when in fact it was a disaster. That stuff is all deeply, deeply offensive and abhorrent. And his lies about the death count are particularly revolting because, we're talking about, thousands and thousands of people who were killed, some of them who didn't, need to die in this disaster. So that's completely disgusting, revolting politics of the sort that we expect from Trump. But it's not as though the key to understanding the entire economic situation in Puerto Rico is Trump. This stuff goes back many, many years, and I think without understanding the whole context of it, it's hard to sort of make sense of what's going on. So the bond crisis predates Trump. The failure to repair the power grid predates Trump. Trump is just so good at drawing attention to his boorish, tweets and behavior that he can kind of eclipse all of these other issues. So even though it's deeply offensive, I think people who are, like the average Puerto Rican, I think, is not sitting around all day reading Trump's Twitter.
I'd like to once again thank Jesse for taking time out of his busy schedule to talk to me about his piece in GQ on Puerto Rico. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you.